Did you ever wonder which grocery items in the 1960s were so luxurious that only the wealthy could afford them? Today, you're stepping back into a world where food wasn't just food. It was status, class, and quiet privilege. And the list may surprise you. Imported Swiss chocolate bars. You remember the first time you held one of these shiny wrapped treasures, don't you? Even if you never tasted one back then, the sight alone told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't candy for ordinary people. This was elegance disguised as dessert. In the 1960s, imported chocolates weren't simply purchased, they were acquired. Most families didn't see them lining supermarket shelves because supermarkets rarely carried them. They came from specialty stores or hidden counters tucked in wealthy neighborhoods. You can almost feel the weight of that bar, heavier than Hershey's, wrapped in foil that made a soft crackle when your fingers pressed into it. The scent alone was different, richer, darker, almost secretive. Swiss chocolate was silkier, creamier, and smoother than anything mass-produced in the States at the time. And you know why? Because while American chocolate cut corners with cheaper cocoa solids, foreign chocolate used higher-fat cocoa butter, which gave it that unmistakable melt-on-the-tongue finish. But the real barrier was price. A bar of Swiss chocolate cost the equivalent of a fancy meal for an entire family. When you compare that with today, where you can walk into any grocery store and casually toss Lindt or Toblerone into your cart without thinking twice, it almost feels unreal. So tell me, if someone handed you a bar of imported chocolate back then, would you savor it slowly or hide it away before anyone else noticed? Real pineapple slices in heavy syrup. If you grew up in the 60s, you know pineapple wasn't just fruit, it was a flex. Today you can buy fresh pineapple for pocket change, but in the early 1960s, pineapple was the closest thing many families ever had to tropical luxury. The moment you cracked open a can of genuine imported pineapple slices, the whole kitchen transformed. That syrupy perfume curled into the air, sweet, tangy, and exotic, in a decade where most fruit bowls held only apples, bananas, and the occasional orange. And there you were, staring at perfectly symmetrical golden rings floating in thick syrup that felt like liquid gold. Why was it such a big deal? Because before modern trade routes and affordable shipping, pineapple remained a symbol of wealth for centuries. In fact, in earlier eras, hostesses rented whole pineapples just for display. But even by the 1960s, the cost of importing pineapple from Hawaii or the Philippines, before mass containerization, remained steep. That meant only upper-middle-class families bought canned pineapple to decorate hams, top cakes, or serve at bridge club gatherings. And compared to today's world, where pineapple chunks sit beside peas in the freezer aisle, it's almost hard to picture how precious it once felt. So think back. Did your family crack open a can only on special occasions? Or did you only ever taste pineapple at someone else's house? European butter, especially French or Danish. You know the taste I'm talking about. The butter that didn't just spread but glided. The kind that made toast feel like it suddenly belonged in a Parisian cafe. In the 1960s, European butter was the silent status symbol sitting in the refrigerators of wealthy families, often wrapped in thick gold foil. While most households smeared margarine or low-cost domestic butter on everything, imported butter carried a richness that told a different story. It had a higher butterfat percentage, 82% or more, compared to America's standard 80%. That tiny difference changed everything. It made pastries flakier, sauces silkier, and simple bread taste like a delicacy. But that quality came with a price tag that most budgets simply couldn't justify, and the experience of using it was sensory from the start. The foil crinkled in a way margarine tubs never could. The butter released a deeper aroma, like sweet cream and warm fields after rainfall. And once it hit a hot pan, the sizzle told you instantly. This wasn't ordinary. Today you can pick up European butter by the block at Walmart or Costco like it's nothing. But back then, it was the kind of thing people whispered about after visiting a friend's well-to-do home. They have French butter. So let me ask you, if you had gotten your hands on a block back then, would you have used it generously or shaved off tiny, careful slices to make it last? Premium olive oil from Italy or Greece. You don't forget the first time you saw a dark green bottle sitting quietly on someone's counter in the 1960s. Back then, olive oil wasn't a pantry staple. It wasn't sitting next to vegetable oil at the grocery store, and it definitely wasn't something the average family bought casually. The moment you noticed it, you felt as though you were peeking into a different lifestyle entirely. One of cultured palates, European vacations, and people who had tastes rather than preferences. You remember how the bottle felt in your hands, heavier, sturdier, with a cork or metal metal cap that clicked softly when opened. It smelled different from anything you knew. Grassy, peppery, almost floral. You knew immediately this wasn't something meant for frying chicken. It was precious. It was intentional. It was reserved for meals that meant something. Why so exclusive? Because in the 1960s, olive oil wasn't produced in the US at scale. Most of it came directly from Italy, Greece, or Spain, where families pressed it in small batches and shipped it overseas in limited quantities. There were no giant distribution chains, no budget-friendly brands, no big-box stores to dilute the price. Importing it was expensive, and because supply was low, the cost stayed high. So only wealthy households, those who traveled or ran in sophisticated circles, used olive oil for salads, bread, or drizzling over vegetables. And compared to today, where olive oil fills entire aisles, the contrast is almost laughable. Today you buy it without thinking. Back then, you admired it the way people admire fine perfume. So, be honest, if someone had handed you a small bottle in 1965, wouldn't you have saved it for guests rather than using it on yourself? Imported Brie and Camembert cheese. If you grew up in the 60s, you remember a time when cheese came in blocks, slices, or processed varieties wrapped in shiny plastic squares. Fancy cheese? That was something you only read about or saw in magazines showing French picnics with people lounging in sunlit fields. So imagine walking into a wealthy neighbor's house and seeing a round wooden box in their fridge, Brie or Camembert. You had no idea cheese could even come in a box like that. When they opened it, the aroma hit you immediately. Earthy, creamy, almost mysterious. And then you saw the rind, soft and edible, something completely foreign compared to the hard edges and uniform shapes you were used to. Imported French cheeses were a luxury in the 1960s because refrigeration for imports wasn't as efficient, and global distribution for perishables was incredibly limited. Anything soft, delicate, or aged had to be flown in, handled carefully, and sold in specialty stores. Only people with money visited those stores, and the price tag for a single wheel could match the cost of a week's groceries. And then there was the experience. The cheese softened as it sat at room temperature, becoming almost molten in the center. The knife slid through it like warm butter. Spread on crackers or bread, it created a texture you couldn't compare to anything else in an era dominated by American slices and cheddar bricks. Today, you can pick up Brie at big box stores or even gas stations. But in the 60s, eating imported cheese didn't just feel sophisticated, it felt international. It felt like stepping into someone else's world for a moment. So tell me, if you had tried it back then, would you have embraced the new flavor, or would you have pretended to like it just to fit in? Real vanilla extract, especially from Madagascar. You remember baking in the 60s? Chocolate chip cookies, pound cakes, maybe the occasional custard. But there was a secret that separated everyday bakers from the wealthy ones. Pure vanilla extract, the real kind, the expensive kind, the kind that came in tiny amber bottles with labels printed in cursive, and prices that made your mother set it back on the shelf with a sigh. Most families used imitation vanilla. Clear liquid, cheap, mass-produced, and artificially flavored. But when you opened a bottle of real vanilla extract, the scent was unmistakable. Warm, floral, sweet, earthy, almost intoxicating. It filled the air instantly, even before it touched the batter. It made everything taste richer, deeper, more luxurious. But the price wasn't just about quality, it was about scarcity. Vanilla beans grow in humid, tropical regions, and Madagascar led the world in production even back then. But harvesting vanilla is one of the most labor-intensive agricultural tasks on Earth. Each flower must be hand-pollinated within a window of mere hours. Then the beans undergo months of curing, drying, sweating, and aging. No shortcuts, no machines, no industrial cheats. So by the time the extract reached a shelf in America, it was practically liquid gold. Most families simply couldn't justify spending money on something that felt optional. Today, vanilla is still expensive, but you can buy a small bottle without feeling like you're committing to a luxury lifestyle. But in the 1960s, real vanilla showed up in the kitchens of people who embraced gourmet cooking before it was mainstream. So let me ask, if you had gotten your hands on a bottle back then, would you have used it generously in your cookies or saved it for holidays only? Fresh herbs, especially basil, dill, and parsley. Before supermarkets turned into botanical jungles with aisles full of herbs, salads, and aromatics, fresh herbs in the 1960s were almost mythical. You had dried herbs, sure, little tins that smelled like dust and green powder, but fresh basil, fresh dill, fresh parsley not wilted into sadness? That was a privilege, a sign of wealth, a sign of someone who shopped differently, cooked differently, and lived differently. You remember how it felt seeing herbs displayed in a wealthy family's kitchen, bright green leaves resting in small glasses of water, water. The smell so vivid it almost felt alive. Fresh basil filled the room with sweetness and spice. Dill smelled like summertime and gardens. Parsley crunched between your fingers instead of collapsing into flakes. Why so exclusive? Because in the 1960s, grocery stores didn't import herbs year-round. They weren't grown in giant industrial greenhouses. They weren't flown across continents in chilled cargo holds. If you didn't grow them in your backyard, and most families didn't, your only chance of getting fresh herbs was visiting a specialty grocer or having enough money to buy from local farmers who treated herbs as premium crops. Fresh herbs transformed food in ways Americans weren't used to. A spoon of basil turned plain tomato sauce into something you couldn't forget. Dill gave fish a brightness that tasted straight out of coastal Europe. Parsley wasn't just garnish, it made dishes taste alive. Today, it's almost funny to think you can walk into Walmart and buy a plastic clamshell of basil for a few dollars. But in the 60s, that clamshell would have been treated like a centerpiece. So imagine, if someone had handed you a bunch of fragrant green herbs in 1964, wouldn't you have felt like you were holding something rare and fleeting? High-quality steak cuts, New York strip, ribeye, tenderloin. You remember Sunday dinners growing up. Meat wasn't an everyday thing, not the premium kind anyway. Most households bought cheaper cuts. Chuck, round, brisket, or whatever looked affordable in the butcher's case. But when a wealthy neighbor brought home a New York strip or a thick ribeye steak, that wasn't just food, it was status. You can still picture the marbling, webs of white fat running through the meat like intricate lace. That marbling wasn't just decoration, it was flavor. It meant tenderness. It meant the steak would sizzle, soften, and practically melt the moment heat touched it. And the smell? You remember that too. The rich, savory aroma rising from cast iron, filling the room with something deep and primal. But here's what made it exclusive. America's cattle industry in the 1960s produced meat differently. Large-scale industrial feeding systems weren't widespread yet. Grain-finished beef, the kind that produced those prized marbled cuts, was costlier and far from common. That meant only the wealthy regularly purchased steaks from the top USDA grades. The rest of the country reserved steak dinners for birthdays, holidays, or very rare paychecks that stretched just far enough. Butchers in upscale neighborhoods had a completely different selection. They carried cuts most everyday families never saw. Cuts wrapped carefully in butcher paper with stamps marking prime, a label that meant something in an era before marketing diluted its impact. Today, premium steaks are expensive but attainable. You can buy a ribeye at any supermarket or visit a big box store and choose from a whole case of them. But in the 1960s, having high-quality steak in your fridge meant you were living in a different tax bracket altogether. So think back, if someone had offered you a thick, perfectly marbled steak back then, would you have eaten it immediately or saved it for the kind of dinner your whole family remembered? Alaskan king crab legs. If you grew up in the 1960s, seafood meant something simple. Frozen fish sticks, canned tuna, maybe a shrimp cocktail on very special occasions. The ocean felt far away, almost like a fantasy reserved for coastal families. And then one day, you saw something that didn't look real. Giant, spiny crab legs, bright red, each one thick as your wrist. You didn't even know crabs could grow that big. When someone wealthy served Alaskan king crab, it felt almost theatrical. You remember the sound of the shell cracking, the way steam drifted upward like a quiet sigh, and the moment a long, snowy white piece of meat slid free. It looked like something out of a magazine. The first bite was unlike any crab you had tried before. Sweet, buttery, firm yet delicate. Every mouthful tasted like cold oceans and clean air, something that didn't feel remotely connected to the world you lived in. But here's why it was so rare. Harvesting king crab in the 60s was dangerous, expensive, and brutal. Fishermen traveled into freezing waters during short seasons, risking their lives hauling massive pots from stormy seas. The industry was small and not yet commercialized. Most of that crab never made it far from the coasts. Shipping it inland required specialized cold storage, insulated containers, and fast delivery, all of which drove the price sky high. Regular families couldn't dream of buying it. Wealthy households, especially those hosting dinners meant to impress, treated king crab like a centerpiece. It wasn't just food, it was proof of means, proof of access, proof that you could afford something fresh from the farthest parts of America. Today you can walk into a buffet or seafood restaurant and see crab legs piled in trays. But in the 60s, if someone handed you a pair of steel crab crackers and placed a towering crab leg on your plate, wouldn't you have felt like you were dining among royalty? Pure maple syrup, grade A, tree tap. If you were a kid in the 1960s, you probably grew up on pancake syrup, the thick, dark, corn syrup-heavy stuff that poured like molasses and tasted like caramel pretending to be something else. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and familiar. But one day, maybe on a trip or in the home of someone more affluent, you tried real maple syrup, and everything changed. The bottle was small, almost comically small. The liquid wasn't as dark. It flowed easily, like amber warmed by sunlight. The scent wasn't sugary. It was earthy, woody, almost smoky. And the first taste? It didn't coat your tongue like artificial syrup. Instead, it lifted, it lingered. It carried notes of the forest, sap, bark, cold mornings, and the slow, patient boil that transformed tree sap into something profound. Real maple syrup was expensive in the 1960s because production was limited to specific regions, mostly Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of Canada. Each tree required careful tapping, and each gallon of syrup came from roughly 40 gallons of sap. There were no shortcuts, no artificial thickening, no chemical enhancements. It was just time, labor, and nature. Most families couldn't justify the cost when breakfast syrup was cheap and easy, but wealthy households, they bought grade A maple syrup like it was fine wine. Some even requested particular sugar houses or farms. They understood the difference between early season and late season runs. They served it in small pitchers, warm, as though it deserved ceremony. And honestly, it did. Today, maple syrup is still pricey, but you can buy it anywhere. Back then, tasting it felt like stepping into a different class. So ask yourself, if someone in 1963 had handed you a warm pitcher of pure maple syrup, would you have poured it freely or rationed it like treasure? Gourmet ice cream, handmade or imported flavors. Before ice cream aisles stretched across entire freezer sections, before boutique brands and exotic flavors, ice cream in the 1960s meant vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry, maybe mint, maybe butter pecan. But wealthy families had something different, something magical, something that made your jaw drop when you opened their freezer: gourmet ice cream. You remember the shock of seeing flavors you had never heard of: pistachio, black raspberry, coffee, French vanilla with specks of real bean. Sometimes the carton wasn't even cardboard. It was metal or painted tin, holding ice cream made in small batches at local creameries that only the affluent knew about. The texture was the giveaway. Regular ice cream was icy, firm, and melted quickly into sugary soup. But gourmet ice cream? It was smooth, dense, silky. You scooped it, and it curled softly, not breaking into shards. When you tasted it, the flavor didn't just hit your tongue. It bloomed. Pistachio tasted like real nuts, not green dye. Coffee tasted like brewed beans, not artificial essence. Vanilla tasted like dessert, not dairy. Why was it so exclusive? Because making premium ice cream required high-fat cream, slow churning, minimal air incorporation, and real ingredients, all expensive and time-consuming. Many gourmet brands imported ingredients: Sicilian pistachios, Madagascar vanilla, Belgian cocoa. Some ice cream was shipped from Europe in insulated containers, arriving in specialty shops that only wealthy families frequented, and the price reflected all that effort. While regular ice cream was cheap enough for birthdays or weekends, gourmet ice cream cost so much that it became a social flex, served at dinner parties, afternoon teas, or as a treat after a night out. Today, you can buy gourmet ice cream for a splurge. But in the 60s, if someone scooped you a bowl of imported hazelnut gelato, wouldn't you have slowed down just to savor every bite? Whole bean coffee, especially imported varieties. You remember when coffee in the 60s smelled like something sharp, harsh, and slightly burnt. Always in a can, always pre-ground, always stored in the same aisle as powdered creamer. Coffee wasn't an experience. It was a ritual of necessity, something you brewed to stay awake, not something you brewed to enjoy. But then you visited someone's home, someone wealthier, more cosmopolitan, and everything changed the moment you smelled it. Coffee that didn't come from a can. Coffee that came from beans, whole beans, glossy, fragrant, stored in airtight jars with labels like Colombian, Ethiopian, or Kenyan. You remember the sound, the grinder whirring loudly, filling the kitchen with a low, warm hum. Then the aroma hit. Rich, floral, spicy, complex. A smell so deep and comforting you almost felt embraced by it. When the coffee brewed, it didn't smell burnt. It smelled alive. And when you tasted it, you realized this wasn't just stronger coffee. It was different coffee. Smooth, bold, layered. Each sip warmed you from the inside like a story told by someone who had lived a wider life than you had. Whole bean coffee was rare in the 60s because global coffee distribution relied on massive batches roasted long before reaching stores. Freshness wasn't part of the equation. Grinding your own coffee was something intellectuals, travelers, or wealthy families did. Many of them owned imported grinders, some manual, some electric, devices that felt like they belonged in art studios rather than kitchens. And the beans themselves, they were expensive. They came from small farms, high-altitude estates, or regions that were difficult to reach. The best beans weren't mass-produced. They They were curated, selected, treated like produce instead of a commodity. Today, whole bean coffee is everywhere, from supermarkets to online subscriptions. But in the 1960s, if someone handed you a warm cup of freshly ground African or South American coffee, wouldn't you have felt like you were drinking something forbidden to the ordinary? Belgian chocolate, true artisan varieties. You remember when chocolate in the 60s meant something very simple. Hershey bars, boxed candies, or maybe a Whitman sampler on Mother's Day. Chocolate was a treat, sure, but it was predictable. Sweet, familiar, ordinary. But then one day, someone richer, someone well-traveled, someone who spoke about food the way people talk about art, handed you a piece of Belgian chocolate. And suddenly, you realized everything you ever knew about chocolate was incomplete. The first thing that struck you wasn't even the taste, it was the texture. It didn't snap like American chocolate. It didn't crumble. It softened slowly between your fingers, almost, as though it had been waiting for body heat, not teeth. When you finally tasted it, you felt a wave of flavor, deep, silky, almost velvet-like on the tongue. There was no graininess, no harsh sweetness, just layers, notes, complexity. In the 1960s, Belgium already had centuries of chocolate craftsmanship behind it. Their chocolatiers were artisans, not factory workers. They used slow grinding processes, stone mills, and high-quality cocoa beans that were carefully roasted and blended. They made pralines filled with ganache and creams so delicate you felt guilty eating them. These chocolates couldn't survive long transport without careful packaging and climate control, which made importing them expensive and rare. Only upscale stores in big cities carried them, small boutiques with glass counters and velvet-lined boxes. Meanwhile, most Americans saw chocolate as candy, something cheap and cheerful. Belgian chocolate wasn't candy. It was a luxury, a statement, a whisper that someone had access to a different world entirely. You didn't casually buy it. You gifted it, displayed it, or saved it for a moment that felt worthy. Today, Belgian chocolate is still premium, but it's accessible. You can pick up a bar in an airport. But think back to the 60s. If someone had opened a golden box of imported pralines in front of you, wouldn't you have felt like you were being invited into a secret few people knew existed? Gourmet canned soups, imported or specialty. You wouldn't think soup could be fancy, but in the 1960s, it absolutely was. While most families relied on Campbell's as the default, gourmet canned soups, especially French onion, lobster bisque, and cream-based European varieties, were seen as luxurious indulgences. The cans themselves gave it away. Imported fonts, foreign languages on labels, and illustrations that looked like they belonged in an upscale recipe book. Opening one felt almost ceremonial. You could smell the difference instantly. The herbs deeper, the broth richer, the texture smoother. This wasn't the thin, watery soup poured from an everyday can. This was an experience meant for slow sipping, not quick eating. Price was the real barrier. These specialty soups cost 2 or 3 times more than mainstream brands, and they were only stocked in high-end grocers or department store food halls. For families who lived paycheck to paycheck, soup was supposed to be the affordable option, not something that cost as much as a restaurant meal. Today, gourmet soups appear in every aisle, from organic varieties to international fusion flavors. But back then, if you saw a can of French onion soup in someone's pantry, you instinctively knew this was a household that entertained differently, ate differently, lived differently. So let me ask you, if someone served you gourmet soup in 1962, would you have thought more about the flavor or the fact that you were being treated to something rare? Instant coffee from Europe. If you lived through the 60s, you remember how coffee tasted back then. Weak, acidic, often sitting too long on a percolator. American households didn't think of coffee as something to savor. It was simply a hot drink to kickstart the day. But European instant coffee? That was a revelation. Brands like Nescafé Gold, imported from Switzerland or the UK, were practically gourmet. The jars looked elegant, thick glass, metallic labels, granules that resembled fine crystals instead of rough powder. And when you twisted off the cap, a deep, warm aroma drifted out, richer and more sophisticated than anything brewed on a stovetop percolator. Why was it so expensive? Because instant coffee manufacturing technology differed drastically overseas. European producers used freeze drying rather than spray drying, which preserved aroma compounds far better. But that also made it pricier. On top of that, imported goods carried high tariffs and limited availability. So only the affluent bought these golden jars, often keeping them in special cabinets like prized possessions. Contrast that with now, imported instant coffee sits casually in the coffee aisle next to everyday brands. No one treats it like treasure anymore. So think back, if you had seen a gleaming jar of European instant coffee in someone's kitchen in 1965, wouldn't you have instantly assumed they lived a different kind of life? Imported canned peaches. Do you remember the first time you saw canned peaches sitting on a supermarket shelf? Their golden slices floating in syrup behind perfectly printed labels that looked like art. Back in the 60s, you never saw them in everyday homes. Only the wealthy could casually drop a tin of imported peaches into their basket. You remember standing on your toes, peeking through the glass counter, watching the grocer stack them like shining treasure. They had weight, literal weight, thick metal, elegant branding, and that soft, rattling sound when you shook the tin gently. The syrup inside sloshed like liquid gold. And when someone finally opened one, the smell. A sweet, almost floral scent rushed out like a secret escaping confinement. The peaches didn't look real. Too glossy, too bright, too perfect. They slid effortlessly onto a plate, the syrup making little amber pools across the porcelain. In the 60s, imported fruit meant luxury. It meant a family had money not just for food, but for the idea of food, for indulgence, for softness. Local fruit was abundant, yes, but something from overseas? That meant status. Today, canned fruit sits on every supermarket shelf, often ignored, cheap, ordinary, sometimes even processed beyond recognition. But in the 60s, imported peaches were a symbol, an edible announcement that a household didn't just survive, they flourished. Do you remember the first time you tasted fruit that came from a country you had never even seen on a map? Tinned corned beef with the key opener. There was a time when the presence of corned beef in a home said everything. Not just any corned beef, but the imported ones with that tiny metal key attached to the side of the can. You hooked the key, twisted the strip, and peeled back the lid in a slow, tense spiral that felt almost ceremonial. Even the sound of the metal curling off, your rip, felt expensive. Inside was meat that didn't crumble. It sliced cleanly, held its shape, and smelled rich, salty, and unmistakably foreign. Rich families used it for sandwiches, stew, breakfast fry-ups, or simply ate it fried as a delicacy. You remember standing in the kitchen watching someone slice it into perfect cubes that glistened in the morning light. And when it hit a hot pan, that sizzle, that aroma, that promise of a meal that felt too good for everyday life. In most households, corned beef was reserved for Christmas or Easter. In richer homes, it was just Tuesday. Today, corned beef is still around, but the magic is gone. The key openers? Gone. The weight of luxury? Gone. The exclusivity? A memory. Do you remember how a single can could make the entire house smell wealthy? Soft white bread in sealed packaging. Before mass production changed everything, most families ate homemade bread or locally baked loaves that hardened by the next morning. But soft, perfectly sliced commercial white bread, sealed in airtight packaging with bright colors and promises of softness, was a luxury only rich people tasted regularly in the 60s. You remember staring at it in stores. The loaf looked like a cloud trapped inside plastic. Uniform slices, fluffy texture, the smell of sweetness when the bag was opened. Rich families used it for school lunches, parties, tea time, or as an everyday staple. Meanwhile, poorer homes treated it like cake, something to be savored, not casually eaten. And that first bite, it melted. It didn't chew. It dissolved into a softness that felt unreal, almost artificial in its perfection. You probably remember how the bread never crumbled, never hardened overnight, and never felt rough. It was the smoothest, most delicate bread you had ever tasted. Today, soft white bread is common, so common it often goes unnoticed. But you still remember a time when it symbolized access, comfort, and modernity. Do you remember the first time you realized bread could feel like luxury? Smoked salmon, especially Scottish or Norwegian. You remember when fish meant something simple, canned sardines, fried fillets, or the occasional fish stick from the freezer. But smoked salmon, that silky, translucent, coral-colored delicacy draped over platters at wealthy gatherings, that was something from another world entirely. The first time you saw it, you probably didn't even know what it was. It didn't look like any fish you recognized. It was too beautiful, too delicate, too intentional. Thin slices fanned out like petals, glistening with oil, sometimes garnished with capers or lemon wedges or a dollop of cream that seemed impossibly elegant. And the taste? Nothing prepared you for it. Smoky but not harsh, salty but not overwhelming, rich but somehow light. It melted on your tongue before you could properly chew it. You didn't eat smoked salmon, you experienced it. In the 1960s, smoked salmon came almost exclusively from Scotland or Scandinavia. The smoking process was slow and traditional, using oak or beechwood over days, not hours. The fish had to be carefully cured, sliced by hand, and shipped in refrigerated containers that barely existed for consumer goods at the time. So all of that made it prohibitively expensive. Only wealthy families served smoked salmon, usually at brunch, cocktail parties, or holiday gatherings where impressing guests mattered more than budget. It appeared on silver platters alongside champagne and fine china, never on everyday tables with paper napkins. Today, you can find smoked salmon in nearly every grocery store, pre-sliced and vacuum sealed. But in the 60s, if someone offered you a thin, glistening slice at a party, wouldn't you have felt like you'd been granted entry into a world most people only read about? Artichoke hearts, marinated or canned. If you grew up in the 1960s, vegetables meant potatoes, carrots, peas, and maybe green beans from a can. Anything beyond that felt exotic. But artichoke hearts, those tender, tangy, impossibly sophisticated morsels packed in oil or brine, that was the vegetable equivalent of wearing pearls to dinner. You remember the first time you saw a jar of marinated artichoke hearts, probably in someone else's kitchen, someone whose house smelled like fresh herbs and whose pantry looked like a European marketplace. The jar itself was elegant, glass, with a label that featured cursive fonts and illustrations of Mediterranean hillsides. Inside, pale green hearts floated in golden oil flecked with herbs and garlic. When you finally tasted one, it was unlike any vegetable you knew. Tender but with texture, tangy from the marinade, earthy and slightly nutty. It didn't taste like something healthy you had to eat. It tasted like something indulgent you got to eat. Why were artichoke hearts so exclusive? Because artichokes themselves were labor-intensive crops, grown primarily in Mediterranean regions and requiring careful harvesting and preparation. Fresh artichokes rarely appeared in American grocery stores, and the canned or marinated versions had to be imported from Italy, Spain, or Greece. High shipping costs, import taxes, and limited demand kept prices steep. Wealthy families used artichoke hearts in salads, on antipasto platters, or as elegant appetizers at dinner parties. They were the kind of ingredient that signaled worldliness, proof that someone had traveled, or at least aspired to the tastes of those who had. Today, artichoke hearts are commonplace. You can find them jarred, canned, or frozen in any supermarket. But in the 1960s, if someone placed a small dish of marinated artichoke hearts in front of you, wouldn't you have felt like you were tasting something that belonged in a Roman villa rather than a suburban kitchen? Ready to discover more fascinating stories from the past? Click on the card showing on the screen.